This is the European History Lecture for Thursday, the 7th?
So true.
Or 6th?
It's the 7th.
7th of April, 2022. And I at least was able to give you a brief taste of the terrain in Arabia and some of the things about the culture. Perhaps if we have time later, I can show you more. I wanted to, but I don't want to take too much time on what is already a giant topic, which is World War I. So, Lawrence is able to inspire the Arabs. The great moment for him is a proposal to take a small group of Faisal's Fedayeen, warriors, holy warriors, and cross the Nephlu Desert to Jordan, where they would encounter the Hawitat, a different tribe, and to convince the Hawitat to go along with the Harith and attack the Turkish port at Aqaba. The Turkish port at Aqaba was considered impregnable because it has 12-inch guns. That is, guns that shoot bullets 12 inches in diameter, battleship guns, basically. But Lawrence pointed out those guns face the sea. They cannot be turned around to face the land. So this is going to be a theme in guns and fortresses in modern times. So, to get there, he's got to cross this impassable desert that the Arabs themselves don't go anywhere near if they can help. And he does so. But there's a man that gets lost. And he turns around and personally goes back into the desert and finds the man at great personal risk and brings him out. So, Lawrence does some things that others say cannot be done. He meets the Hawitat. He convinces them to go after Aqaba. And they combine and move towards Aqaba. Except there's a murder. It's a clan revenge murder for a long grudge between families. So one of the Hawitat is murdered by one of the Harith. That murder has to be avenged. If a Hawitat kills the Harith, these are two different tribes, remember, the Harith will have to revenge. In any case, it's the end of the attack on Aqaba. Until Lawrence himself says, I have no tribe. I will execute justice. He takes out his Webley revolver, and the man is brought to him, and it's the exact man that he took out of the desert. So he shoots him, dead. And the fatalistic Arabs, and there is a deep fatalism in them, says, well, it was written that he would die after all. Lawrence came into the desert and tried to save him, but he was doomed to die. It was his fate that he would die. And fatalism is something that warrior people tend to have anyway. So Lawrence becomes a great war leader to the Arabs. He understands Arab culture, he understands Islam, he speaks the language perfectly, he understands what will impress them, and he also understands modern warfare. So, as the British move across Sinai, an Arab revolt is going to percolate its way northwards, in parallel with it, to the east of it, to disorganize the Persians. And Lawrence is going to be a huge part of that. He's going to be a major leader in that. In 1917, the British commander, General Allenby, is approaching Jerusalem. Lawrence's forces are to the east. And the British decide that they are going to do something that should help them in the war in terms of finance, in terms of international relations, and in terms of support among the Americans. Arthur Balfour, who is a former Prime Minister of Britain, Okay. In conjunction with Chaim Weizmann, who is the head of the International Zionist Movement, which is Jewish nationalism, come together to write a declaration of the Imperial British government, the Balfour Declaration, which says that if Britain wins the war, a Jewish homeland shall be established in Palestine. Now, Jewish nationalism, like all other forms of nationalism, were sparked in the 19th century. This idea that we are of a people that is unique and distinct and separate from all others, and that we have a superiority, at least not necessarily a racist or supremacist superiority, but we're unique. We're not necessarily better than anyone else, although the German national anthem is Germany, Germany, overall, in the world. Because we're unique, what is special about us needs to be preserved. So, the Jews have been in the diaspora for a very long time, since Hadrian. And the Balfour Declaration gives them hope that perhaps, finally, they can come home. Actually, before the First World War, a number of Jews had immigrated into Ottoman Palestine. And a number of the Jews who were there fought on the side of the Ottoman Turks as, patriotic residents. But their numbers were never very great. Britain promises to rewrite history and allow a Jewish homeland for the first time since the 130s AD. Jerusalem is captured. The Arabs continue to march by their side. And by this point, the Arabs hope for freedom from the Ottomans. And Lawrence has promised them that the British are not coveting their lands. The key to the entire campaign is Al-Damask, the city of Damascus. But as the Arabs and the British are approaching Damascus, an agreement between Britain and France and Russia, called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, is published. Published by the Bolsheviks, who had a copy of it because the Russians were sort of allied. And what the Sykes-Picot Agreement does is it divides up the Arabian lands. The French are going to get Syria because they have a connection to the Maronite Christians there. The British are going to get Iraq and Palestine and Jordan. And basically it takes the Arab lands and divides them up into British and French colonies. The Arabs are furious at this. They feel betrayed. Lawrence is revealed to be a functionary, not an independent chieftain, because Lawrence cannot guarantee the actions of his government. And in this spirit of acrimony, the Arabs take Damascus before the British get there. And the Arabs decide they're going to try to establish a new independent Arabia. The British decide they're going to prove something. And they sit back and they let the Arabs try to run a modern city. Power generation doesn't happen. The waterworks breaks down. Without water in a desert country like Syria, Damascus is uninhabitable. Hospitals have people dying because there aren't medicines and doctors. And finally, the Arab moment where they could have seized history falls apart because they really are still locked in the Middle Ages. They do not understand the modern world. And the Arab world gets divided. The Turks are going to keep Turkey. The Hashemites are going to be put in charge in Jordan and in Iraq. but the British and French effectively divide the Arab Middle East into zones of influence. So World War I creates the modern Middle East crisis because, A, the Western world is increasingly dependent upon Middle Eastern oil. B, a Jewish homeland is established in Palestine. The problem that the British realize is the local Arabs resent this. They oppose this. A new Arab leader, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Arabs in that part of the world, arises as a result of this anti-Jewish sentiment. In the 1930s and 40s, he becomes a close ally of Adolf Hitler because they have the same goal, to exterminate the Jews. The stage is set. What's going to happen after World War II? Increased Jewish settlement that is so large that it drives the Arabs insane, to extreme violence. But Jewish settlement so small that the Jews feel betrayed, that it's not a real homeland that's being established. And so by the time of World War II, there are Arab terrorists killing British soldiers and Jews, and there are at least two groups of Jewish terrorists killing British soldiers and Arabs. Oh, and the Arab terrorists, what they really do is they make a specialty of killing Arabs that work with Jews. So if you're a moderate Arab who is willing to live in tolerance with Jews, you're target number one to the Arab groups. And this violence, this inability to even want to seek compromise, is going to define the Middle East crisis that we have lived with for the past 70, 80 years. World War I is the cause. Now we go back to Europe. In the East, the Russian Bolsheviks signed the Brest-Litovsk Agreement. Brest-Litovsk establishes an independent Ukraine under Hetman Skoropadsky, who is a German ally. And independent, or actually the Germans get what they call Courland. Courland is what we would call today Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And a bunch of other Russian territory goes to Germany or German client states. This is not what the Bolsheviks wanted. Trotsky, Lenin's aide, tries to say to the Germans, we're going to have neither war nor peace. We won't sign an agreement with you, but we won't fight. At which point the Germans said, you won't fight? Fine, we'll just take as much territory as we want. Within 2 weeks, Trotsky was back signing a treaty because the Germans had taken thousands more square miles of Russian territory. The Bolsheviks get what they need. They get out of the war. They have provided peace, at least with the Germans, which is part of their peace bread and land. With the Bolsheviks pulling out of the war, the Germans keep a skeleton force in the East to enforce the peace and to protect their allies from the commies. They are able to move millions of men west. This happens in early 1918. Now, what they find is an altered Western Front to an extent. In late 1916, early 1917, the German government resumes unrestricted submarine warfare. They feel that it is absolutely indispensable to starve Britain. Without a starved Britain, Germany will achieve no victory. The two giant dreadnought navies that have been built up have not been able to secure anything definitive for either side. But the submarine is Germany's naval weapon. It is a razor to the throat of Britain. With the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, increased antagonism with the United States happens. But that's not what causes the war. A lot of textbooks falsely say when Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare, we go to war. No, that's not it. That sets the stage. What causes the war is something called the Zimmermann Telegram. German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann, anticipating an American intervention in the war on the side of the Allies against Germany, wants to give America troubles in North America that will prevent it from sending an army across the Atlantic into Europe. Mexico has been involved in a civil war since before the beginning of World War I. Mexican factions are literally fighting over the corpse of their country. One of them is Emiliano Zapata, a communist Indian war leader who wants to take Mexico out of the Western world. Another guy is Francisco Pancho Villa. Pancho is his nickname. And Francisco Pancho Villa controls a number of North Mexican provinces. And he decides, for reasons that make sense to him, to attack a border town called Columbus, New Mexico. Pancho Villa's army crosses the American frontier and attacks Columbus, New Mexico. But what's surreal about this is there's an American film crew that's sympathetic, at least to Villa's side in the Mexican Civil War, and they get Villa's agreement. He can film the attack on an American town live. So you have the Mexican bandit army of Francisco Pancho Villa attacking an American town with an American film crew filming it. But the creepy thing is, after the attack, when Columbus is in Mexican hands temporarily, the film crew says to Villa, "It doesn't look persuasive. Could you restage the attack, please? We need shots of horsemen coming down Main Street." So they actually do it. The Mexicans under Villa restaged the attack for the film crew to make it look more realistic than the actual attack looked. You can't make this up. This is 1916. So Woodrow Wilson decides, this is one of the things a few things I agree with him about, this can't stand, and he sends an American army into Mexico to punish Villa and to kill the people who violated our territory. General John J. Blackjack Pershing, the same guy who killed the Filipino rebels with pig's blood and bullets in order to break their spirit, is placed in command of the American army invading Mexico. The problem is, it's like in the summertime, you are dealing with mosquitoes. Now, if you deal with mosquitoes in April or May or October or something, the air is colder and they're slow. You can snatch mosquitoes out of the air if you want to. But if it's July or August, high summer, and you're a warm-blooded mammal, and the mosquitoes are around, they're too fast because they're in their prime, they're in their element. The air is warm, they're happy, we're not, and so and you get the idea. So that is what happens to General Pershing. The American army is slow. The Villa's forces are fast, and they basically chase us. They lead us on a merry chase, and we don't get anywhere. So we pull out because the real war is about to start. So what Arthur Zimmermann, German foreign minister, does is he sends a telegram to the Mexican authorities, to the various war leaders in Mexico, saying, if the U.S. joins the Allies, Mexico should join Germany and attack the United States. Whether or not you win or lose, with a German victory, we will insist that the territory taken from Mexico in the 1850s Mexican-American War will be returned to Mexico. That is, the state of California, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico will be given to Mexico. Now, the only way to get this message across the Atlantic is on telegraph lines that were made and placed and are maintained by the British. But Zimmerman trusts his codes. He's going to transmit this in code to the German embassy in Mexico City, and it should be fine. The British won't be able to break it, he assumes. However, during both World Wars, the British tend to be incredibly good code breakers. They, in fact, tend to be the best code breakers in the world, thinking about it. And so the diplomatic code that the Germans use has long been broken. So the British read this. The Germans are offering to carve the United States up for Mexico if, oh yeah, this is going to be good. And the British leak this story to the American media. And the American people, how dare you? How dare you? How dare you talk about carving up the United States like a Thanksgiving turkey? And that is what provokes the war. Submarine warfare is part of it, but the Zimmerman telegram crystallizes it. Wilson asks for a declaration of war. Congress overwhelmingly but not unanimously approves, and the United States is at war with the German Empire, the Austrians, and so forth. However, the American army is smaller than the Portuguese army at this point in time. It's going to take about a year for the American army to recruit and train and equip a force large enough to matter on the Western Front. So we declare war in the spring of 1917. But in the spring of 1918, there are not very many American forces yet on the line. In mid-1917, the American general John J. Blackjack Pershing arrives in France. When he steps onto the French docks, he famously says, "Lafayette, we are here," which is a reference to the American Revolutionary War, where the French nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette, left France, came to the rebels to fight against the British, and help train America's forces in George Washington's Continental Army. So we are paying Lafayette back. And if you've ever listened to or seen Hamilton, the rock rap musical, there are many references to Lafayette in it. He's a major character. So Lafayette, we are here. But even though the American commander is in France, it takes a while for significant American forces to arrive. Again, over a year. So, it's the spring of 1918. Russia's out, America's in, but American forces have not yet arrived in numbers. The Germans have a window of opportunity. For the first time, they have a numerical advantage, a significant numerical advantage, on the Western Front. They've been on the defensive, for the most part, for the last 4 years. The only attacks they've done have been at places like Verdun to draw the French into a killing zone and then bleed their army white. But for the first time since the battles of the Marne at the opening stages of the war, the Germans are ready to attack. This is going to be called the St. Michael Offensive. It's also called the Kaiserschlacht, which is the Emperor's Battle. But St. Michael is the patron saint of Germany. And the St. Michael Offensive is Germany's attempt to win the war before American troops arrive in significant numbers. Now, by this point, the British have developed the tank, the land ironclad. Slow tractors that are armored, some of which have machine guns, others of which have light guns. And the British have used tanks to some effect. One of the things that tanks produce is a psychological condition called tank terror. You have soldiers who are wearing shirts and who have helmets that are designed to stop shrapnel, not bullets. And the earth shakes, and this rumble approaches, and you see this beast that looks like it comes straight out of hell. It's a tank, and it's belching fire, and you can shoot at it, but nothing happens. It just keeps inexorably rolling towards you. Tank terror causes veteran troops to break and run. But the British tanks move at a pace slower than a walking man. And they break down a lot. So by 1918, the Germans have learned how to deal to an extent with tank terror. Now, they try producing tanks, but they're never very good at it. Their tanks are too big and too slow, and there are too few of them. No, what the Germans do is they invest in people. They develop what is called the Stormtrooper. Now, I know, if you've watched Star Wars, Stormtroopers they wear white plastic armor that doesn't stop anything. I mean, Ewoks killed them. And they can't shoot. I mean, but they can shoot. Pew, 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 pew. But they don't hit anything because they're Imperial Stormtroopers. German Stormtroopers are very different. First off, what the Germans do is they take the best men from every one of their other units and put them together in Stormtrooper units. These are the men that are still physically fit, that are able to do aggressive warfare, that are able to carry a lot of weight, that are psychologically willing to kill, that are basically the best troops in every unit are concentrated into these elite Stormtrooper units, number one. Number two, their uniforms have a lot of pockets for grenades. So these guys each carry basically a small arsenal of grenades. And the thing about a grenade is either you're going to kill a bunch of your enemies or you're going to make a bunch of your enemies take cover because you've thrown a grenade out. So each of these guys has a lot of explosives on them that they can just hurl. That's number two. Number three, they are given the world's first functional submachine gun, the Bergmann 1917. Now, a submachine gun is a small weapon that shoots a pistol-sized round, like a burp. They're also known as burp guns. The Bergmann 1917 allows a single soldier to carry what is in effect a tiny machine gun. So, as the Stormtroopers approach, where you all would be in a trench with bolt-action rifles, you get three guys with submachine guns. I take the guys over here, he takes the guys over here, he takes the guys over here, and we just go, psst, and you're all dead. Psst, at the same time as psst, at the same time as psst. So the Stormtroopers are able to, because of their physicality, move across no man's land quickly. They are able to carry explosives, and they have the submachine gun and lots of ammo, which is going to allow them to be basically mobile killing machines, like superheroes. Oh, and instead of doing what everyone has done since the beginning of the war, which is massively hit the enemy with artillery before you attack, which kind of telegraphs where you're about to strike. You know, you hit an enemy area for 3 or 4 days or 3 or 4 weeks with artillery, and both were done. Before you attack, the enemy knows where your attack's going to be, and they'll just move reinforcements in to counter. That's not what the Stormtroopers do. They introduce a really complicated maneuver called the rolling barrage. So, let's say the German lines are here, the Allied lines are between Haley and Alexandria. Normally, we'd paste you for days or weeks with artillery, and you in the front lines would be, but the people behind the attack would be ready to just step in and help you out. But instead of telegraphing that, what I do is I start hitting the area about 50 to 150 feet in front of my guys as they move forward at a predetermined rate, which is fast. So the guys go out and then it hits you, and as it goes past you, the stormtroopers are already at your trenches. Now, you can see the problem. They don't have radios. It's not like in World War II where everyone has a walkie-talkie. So the artillery has to be very, very careful about precisely where they're firing and how quickly they're moving the rolling barrage forward. Because if they go too quickly, the artillery will outpace the men, and you guys will come up and shoot my men dead before they get to your trenches. If they go too slowly, or if they stutter, okay, pachoom, 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 ah! And it's friendly fire, it's fratricide. And that's why nobody else really did rolling barrages for most of the war, because it's really hard to coordinate. But the Germans, if they're good at one thing, it's organization. And so they do this. So now they have an advantage in numbers, and they have stormtroopers, and they're ready to go, and the St. Michael Offensive begins. Now, the goal is the city of Amiens, and to cut off the British from the rest of the lines. At first, the French collapse. The French lines actually collapse, and the Germans are on their way to Paris again. The British lines also collapse, and everyone's reeling in confusion, running away. These Germans are scary, and they're taking a lot of ground. So the initial part of St. Michael's Offensive, or the Kaiserschlacht, is extremely successful. But what stops it is almost impossible to imagine. The British have blockaded Germany. No international trade gets into Germany or Austria from the beginning of the war. Now, as Napoleon can tell you, Europe has many qualities, but it doesn't have the natural resources to exist in a modern way without resources coming in from around the world. So German industry has been starved of natural raw materials. They do things like they develop artificial oil and artificial fuel and things like that. But a lot of the, bless you, more modern fertilizers require a chemical industry that gets resources from all over the world, and they can't. So what happens is their crop yields are getting smaller and smaller, lower and lower. After all, so many of their men are in the military, and they don't have the fertilizers they should, and basically there's less and less food. So at first, what the Germans do is they cut their bread with increasing proportion of sawdust. Yes, you can put sawdust in as you are baking bread, and instead of using a loaf that takes 100% wheat, you make a loaf that has 40 or 50% wheat and 40 or 50% sawdust. It'll still fill you up, but it's not going to have the nutrition, and it's going to taste god-awful. But they did that. They also found, they used every bit of the meat, the offal. I mean, parts of animals that they slaughter that you'd never use for human food, they're using for human consumption. In 1916, the imperial government in Germany says, we no longer have the food to feed our pigs. We need that food to feed people. So, all pigs within the German Empire will be slaughtered by a certain date. So, for a very short period of time, you have an overflow of bacon and ham and pork and sausages and all that good pork product stuff. And then it's gone. And there's not going to be any more. So the German diet, which is already extremely pork heavy, suddenly loses one of its major meat sources. And the other animals that are used for meat are also dwindling in numbers. So what's been happening is the German army has been on reduced rations for years. And the rations, the food that it's been getting, has been of lower and lower and lower quality. The civilians in Germany are even worse. What's ultimately going to end the war in Austria are food riots. Germany, too. Again, food riots, you don't ever want to experience a food riot. Food riots is human beings descending to the level of animals. Remember, food riots were a big part of the French Revolution. So the German soldiers, even the stormtroopers, who have been hungry for years, begin to take Allied supply dumps. Allied supply dumps with food, real food, bread, cheese, meat, wine, tobacco, because everyone smokes. And what happens is huge numbers of German troops just stop. They stop the attack and they just start eating and drinking to satiate a hunger that is bone deep, and no one can get them going again. The German army, which wasn't being contained by the Allies, is stopped by its own empty bellies at critical moments. So the British save Amiens, and the French reform in front of Paris. And in the Second Battle of the Marne, the Germans are thrown back again. And by this point, by the summer of 1918, the German opportunity has gone. American forces have finally arrived in large numbers. Now, because of the desperation of the German attack, the Allies agreed to something that they had resisted for years. The French had been saying since the beginning of the war, all armies in France should be under French command. The British said, bite me, we're an independent ally, we're going to have our own army in our own zone. The Americans basically said the same thing. But in the darkest moments of the St. Michael Offensive, the British and the Americans agree to come under a French general's command. So Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the French, becomes the supreme commander of the Allied forces in France. And this is a good thing, in that Allied armies, all of them, are now coordinated as part of one big master plan. The Americans fight their first battles. The Germans christen the Marines with one of their favorite titles. The U.S. Marines are called Teufelhunden, or devil dogs, because the Germans who fight them think of them as hounds from hell. I mean, the Americans are like troops back in 1914. They're big. They're aggressive. They're like German stormtroopers, but without the hunger. The American troops are stupid in many ways in that we don't really listen to the British and French because we think they're little scrawny cowards. And we do things like human wave attacks. But because the Germans are so tired and the Americans are so bold and the differences in size and stamina are so great, sometimes it works. So at the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, the Americans take part in their first real offensive in the autumn, late summer and early autumn of 1918. And the Germans are being pushed back towards Germany. In October, what the Germans call the Black Day of the German Army occurs, when forces stop obeying. Basically, the Allies are pushing ahead, and there are no more reserves. And those forces that have been pulled out of the line to rest simply do not have it in them to get up and keep fighting. At this point, after the German army basically breaks on the Black Day of the German army, no reserves, and the fighters that they have are just incapable of continuing to fight aggressively or well, the High Command informs Kaiser Wilhelm that they're not able to win the war. Food riots are already happening across Austria-Hungary, and the government there is falling. A communist regime is going to take over in Hungary for a while. In Germany, food riots and communist uprisings have happened in a number of cities, and even the Kaiser's beloved high seas fleet of dreadnought battleships and battle cruisers is now in the hands of Red Sailors, Soviets. The Kaiser, at the end of October, beginning of November, abdicates and flees to Holland, the one country in Western Europe he didn't conquer. The Dutch accept him, and the Kaiser is going to live the rest of his life at a mansion at Doorn in Holland. And later in life, he's famous for doing wood cutting with his one good arm. You know, he'll go out and he's got his little withered arm, and he's got his gigantic, massive arm. And he'll chop trees down and chop them into firewood with one arm, which is not an easy thing to do. But he's out. He has to sneak out, sneak away. So with the Kaiser gone, the Germans establish a republic, and they think that they're going to get good terms. Why? President Wilson, when around the United States' entry into the war, promulgates what he calls his 14 points. Wilson's 14 points amount to something called peace without victory. The idea is that the sides will effectively return to a 1914 status, that both sides will agree that the war was a disaster. The Germans will have to pay a price, but it's not going to be an incredibly steep one. Wilson's 14 points also lays out concepts like national self-determination and a bunch of other idealistic American points of view. But basically, it can be summarized, peace without victory. So the Germans agree to a ceasefire, an armistice. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of the year 1918, the guns stop. The armies are no longer engaged in combat on the Western Front. The war is over, and Germany's armies go home. This sets the stage for the surrender of Austria-Hungary, the surrender of the Ottoman Empire, and chaos. The farther east you go in Europe, the more chaotic it's going to be. Meanwhile, at Paris and at Versailles, plans are made for the year 1919 for the victorious powers to gather and come up with a peace treaty and then present it to the Germans. This is important. The Congress of Vienna, which was about rebuilding Europe after Napoleon, included French representatives. It was a peace arrived at with the help of the successor governments of the defeated nation. But nothing could be more different from the Congress of Vienna than the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans are going to be kept out. And in keeping the Germans out and in treating them like the defeated nation, not the successor to the Kaiser who was defeated, seeds are going to be sown that are going to sprout just 20 years later. I once said that one of the most interesting subjects in modern history would be a comparison between the Congress of Vienna that produces the Concert of Europe and the Treaty of Versailles, which produces World War II and Nazism. A couple of years ago, a history student from here named George Kurowski did that. It's still a worthy and an interesting topic. So the war is over in Europe, and we will talk about the aftermath of the war tomorrow. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Okay. Then we're done. Thank you.